Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining for this talk for your party. The title today is Welfare Corporatism, a continuing post-war consensus question mark. And the talk follows on from the last one after the fall of the first majority Labour government that lasted from 1945 until 1951. And this talk will take us from 1951 up to the late 70s. So, the experience of wartime planning and the first majority Labour government that involved not just government, but also all other stakeholders, including employers and trade unions, had a profound effect on the type of society that followed for the next 30 years or so. Although it came as a big surprise that Labour won a landslide victory in 1945, it shouldn't have, because during the Second World War, whilst Churchill was fighting a war, the Labour Party under Attlee and the trade unions were virtually running the country as their part in the wartime coalition. So, for example, I think I said last time it was the trade unions that actually directed labour to where it was most needed, especially in the construction industry, where building worker trade union branches instructed workers where to go and what work needed doing. So they had a lot of experience already. Right, right, there we go. Now, some commentators have called that period from 1945 until the late 1970s the era of Butzkelism. Now, Butzkelism was a term used to describe government policies that were prevalent in post-war Britain from the 1940s up until the late 1970s. In other words, it was characterised by a broad consensus between the Conservative and Labour parties on key economic and social issues. The term Butzkelism, as you may have guessed, is derived from a portmanteau of the surnames of two Chancellors of the Exchequer, the left-leaning Tory Rab Butler, who you might remember from last time, created the tripartite education system to give working class kids greater opportunities in secondary education, and the right wing Labour Chancellor Hugh Gateskill. And it was based on the fictional figure Mr. Butskell, which was created by The Economist magazine to symbolise the convergence of policies between the two major parties. And this consensus encompassed support for a mixed economy between private and public, a strong welfare state, and Keynesian demand management of the economy aimed at maintaining full employment. So rather than campaign for a return to unfettered laissez-faire capitalism, the Conservative Party recognised that a strategy like that would be electorally disastrous for them, and so they were much more pragmatic. I don't know what's gone wrong with this because it's not moving. Oh, there we go. So, when we talk about conservative pragmatism, they they did continue to oppose the National Health Service, but that was their only major difference to Labour, because they saw the NHS as a successful expression of socialism that might give the working class other ideas. But they were pragmatic in wanting to preserve nationalised industries. They supported the preservation of nationalisation in the industries that had been nationalised by the Labour Party during 45 to 51. So, despite Labour's defeat in 1951, the Tories recognised that their paymasters in the capitalist class had bankrupted many industries, especially service industries, and nationalisation had been necessary to save them and continued to be necessary as a service to the rest of capital, especially as most of the nationalised industries were being run like private businesses anyway. There was a recognition from the Tories that the welfare state was here to stay. After the privations that had been suffered by the working class in the so-called hungry 30s, they recognised that workers would not accept a return to those times. So the type of society that prevailed for much of this period is also sometimes called welfare capitalism. There was a continuation of Keynesian demand management economic policies. These were policies that were focused on full employment, where government intervened in the economy to stimulate demand. So, put quite simply, it's better to pay a worker to dig holes in the road and fill them in again than to have them unemployed, because the money they earn will be spent on goods that will create even more jobs and greater prosperity. Economists call that the multiplier effect. However, opponents warned that if the extra income that was generated was spent on imports instead of domestically created goods, it would create inflation and in the long run would lead to more problems. Well, Keynes's answer to that was yes, it would, but in the long run, we're all dead anyway. But was it stoking up problems for 30 years down the line? Lastly, council house building was regarded as an investment by both Conservatives and Labour. So the Tories and Labour continued with an ambitious council house building programme right up until the 1970s. This in itself created more jobs and was part of the multiplier effect. And, I said last time that the post-war Labour government authorised local authorities to set up direct labour departments to mass build council homes. And the target was a very ambitious 200 to 300,000 homes a year. An incredible target, but Labour and successive Tory governments achieved this target every year. And so these schemes continued for 30 years, right up until Thatcher came along. And, I'm using this slide as an example, which I used last time, of a site I worked on in the early 1970s for the Greater London Council, building this estate of flats and houses. And Pete and myself and Pete, my carpenter friend, we built those vestibules on the front of the flats on that estate. Anyway, so successful were these demand management policies, and such was the need to rebuild Britain after the Second World War, that there was a severe shortage of labour, especially to do the low paid jobs in the public sector, jobs like road sweepers, ancillary workers in the National Health Service, bus conductors, railway porters, and so on. There was a shortage of people to do these low paid jobs. So the government invited workers to come from the West Indies to fill these posts. Yes, they invited them. Um, they arrived on various ships, but they're called the Windrush generation because the first to arrive in Britain came on the Empire Windrush, which was a converted Second World War troop carrier. When I went on a cruise from Tilbury in February, I noticed this banner celebrating the Windrush generation in the departures lounge. Later in the 1970s, there was an influx of South Asians holding British passports. They came from India, West Pakistan, as it was called then, and East Pakistan, as it was called then. East Pakistan was later renamed Bangladesh in 1971. Also, because of the policy of Africanization in some African countries like Kenya and Uganda, Asians holding British passports who had settled in these countries were expelled and they came to Britain. A good friend of mine came with his family as a 10-year-old from Kenya. Many of the influx of Asians initially settled in the north of England to work in the cotton mills and other sweatshops like clothing manufacturers in the East End of London. There was plenty of work for everyone during this period. So, what was the reason for that? Well, this period from the 1940s until the 1980s is also sometimes called the period of corporatism. Now, corporatism doesn't mean rule by corporations. The word corporatism is derived from the Latin word corpus, meaning like the human body, with all parts working in harmony. And what it involved basically was class collaboration through a system of tripartite economic governance, cooperation between government, employers, and trade unions. A consensus emerged which was characterized by a shared commitment to full employment, a mixed economy, and the expansion of the welfare state. So this period saw a strong role for the state in economic planning and social engineering, with the government acting as a central coordinator between employers and trade unions. Having said all that, the extent of political consensus on the welfare state and economic structures I may have somewhat overstated. Because whilst Labour governments championed universalism and a planned economy, Conservative administrations focused more on restoring what they described, in inverted commas, as sound finance and dismantling some elements of the welfare state, as well as policies aimed at controlling prices and moderating wage demands. This indicates that tripartite governance wasn't monolithic or unchanging, but it was one that evolved gradually and was contested to some extent across different political administrations. Nevertheless, there was always a degree of consensus that all stakeholders in rebuilding Britain should be involved. Although the left had a great deal of influence at the rank and file level, Trade unions, by and large, were led by right-wing bureaucrats. Indeed, planning in conjunction with business and trade unions that had been a hallmark of wartime governance became the norm. And one of the reasons for this was the growth of trade unionism. As you can see from this graph, trade union membership grew rapidly after the Second World War to peak at nearly 14 million by 1979. That was roughly half the workforce. If we included spouses and children of trade unionists, the majority of the population lived in homes where trade unionism was the norm. But as you can also see, the number has declined and now stands at roughly 6 million, and we'll see why in the next talk. Anyway, as a consequence of the high level of trade unionism, sectoral bargaining, where trade unions negotiated terms and conditions for all workers who worked in a particular sector of the economy, became the norm. Whether those people were trade union members or not, their wages and conditions were set by bargaining with trade unions. So consequently, by the late 70s, 80% of workers in Britain worked under terms and conditions that were negotiated by a trade union, whether they were trade union members or not. But today, it's only 20%. And we'll look at the reasons why and the consequences of that later. For those sectors of the economy where there was weak or non-existent trade union organisation, there were what were called statutory wages councils. These were established in 1945 and they set minimum pay and conditions for 3.5 million workers working in over 60 different sectors of the economy. Bear in mind there was no national minimum wage then. However, because the whole system was based on industrial paternalism, there was trouble ahead. So at the same time as sectoral bargaining was taking place with trade union leaders, at rank and file level, the rise of the shop stewards movement in the 1960s, a movement that was much more militant, meant that local bargaining was increasingly more important than national deals, as unofficial strike action was used to improve workers' wages further. So this led to considerable wage drift between what was negotiated nationally and what workers could get through industrial action at local levels. To give you some idea of the difference, when I was working on building sites during the 1970s, on one site I worked where I was the convener of shop stewards, me and the 6 other shop stewards negotiated bonuses on top of our basic wage, which basically doubled our wages. And on some sites, I know that wages were trebled by that local negotiation and strike action. So the number of strikes increased greatly during the 1960s and 70s. So in 1968, Harold Wilson's Labour government appointed the Donovan Commission to review British labour laws with a view to reducing the number of days lost to strikes every year. And it found much of the problem to lie in a parallel system of official signed agreements between unions and employers and unofficial, often unwritten ones at the local level between shop stewards and managers, which often took precedence in practice over the official ones. The government responded with a white paper prepared by the Secretary of State for Employment, Barbara Castle, entitled In Place of Strife, which recommended restrictions on a union's ability to strike, such as requiring strikes to take place after a ballot and fining unions for unofficial strikes. I mean, before that, we just used to have a show of hands in the works canteen, whether we wanted to go on strike or not. The Trade Union Congress vigorously opposed making Castle's recommendations law, and a cabinet revolt led to its abandonment. The cabinet didn't believe that it would be effective in curtailing unofficial strikes, that the proposals couldn't pass through Parliament, and the effort would create unnecessary tension between the government and the unions, who were key to its political strength. After the Conservatives won the general election in 1970 under Ted Heath, they implemented their own legislation to address the issue. The Industrial Relations Act 1971 faced determined union opposition because it included many of the same provisions as In Place of Strife had, and explicitly stated that formal collective bargaining agreements would have the force of law unless they had disclaimers to the contrary. In other words, local shop stewards couldn't pressurise employers to overrule them in favour of something better for workers. The Act also created a National Industrial Relations Court to handle disputes and put unions under a central registry to enforce their rules. Ted Heath hoped that the new law would not only address the strike issue, but also address the steep inflation plaguing the British economy, at the same time as eliminating the need for a separate incomes policy. Ongoing union resistance to the Industrial Relations Act led to a House of Lords ruling in the government's favour over demonstrations and widespread official strikes. However, following the imprisonment of 5 London dockers for continuing to picket a London container depot in violation of a court order under the Act, there was a massive reaction that ultimately undermined the legislation. The Pentonville Five, as they became known, because they were held in Pentonville Prison, were Derek Watkins, Tony Merrick, Connie Clancy, Bernie Steer, and Vic Turner. They were arrested on the 21st of July 1972 for defying an injunction issued by the National Industrial Relations Court to stop picketing the Midland Cold Storage Company in Hackney, East London. Their actions were part of a national campaign by shop stewards to protect dockers' jobs and the threat posed by the introduction of containerisation in the docking industry. Their arrest triggered widespread solidarity actions across the whole of Britain, including mass picketing at the prison, a march of approximately 15,000 workers from Tower Hill to Pentonville, a national march that attracted over 100,000 people, and a wave of unofficial strikes among dockers, printers, miners, transport workers, and others. As a consequence of all this, the TUC, the Trade Union Congress, called for a one-day general strike on the 31st of July. The pressure from this mass mobilisation led to the five being released just 5 days after they'd been imprisoned on the 26th of July 1972, following a reinterpretation of the law by the government's own official solicitor, a post that nobody had heard of before and one that was clearly invented to get the government off the hook. So the Tory government had clearly backed down. The release of the Pentonville Five was celebrated as a major victory for the trade union movement, with the five being carried from the prison on the soldiers of supporters under the banner Arise Ye Workers. And I was lucky enough to be there outside Pentonville Prison on that historic day. So their release was seen as a triumph for rank and file action over union bureaucracy and political leadership. With Labour left-wingers like Tony Benn and Eric Heffer highlighting the political nature of the arrests and the importance of solidarity. These events eventually led to the repeal of the Industrial Relations Act by the incoming Labour government 2 years later. Again, I think this story remains a powerful example of collective action and working class solidarity. But while we still had a Tory government in 1972, at the beginning of 1972, the miners, who remember at this time numbered 300,000 and were all members of the National Union of Mine Workers, and also were the most organised militant section of the working class, went on strike primarily over wages not keeping pace with inflation. It marked the first official national miners' strike in Britain since 1926, which I talked about in a previous talk. The strike was characterised by the use of flying pickets to persuade other workers to join in solidarity, leading to railway workers refusing to transport coal and power station workers refusing to handle coal. This caused significant power shortages, prompting the government to declare a state of emergency after an unexpectedly cold weather increased demand for electricity. And the Battle of Saltley Gate, and I think this is important as well, was a pivotal event during the strike, when a mass picketing campaign targeted a fuel storage depot operated by the West Midlands Gas Board in Birmingham. At the time, the miners were predicted by the right-wing press to be unlikely to succeed with the strike, with some journalists, I remember, likening their position to that of the Light Brigade in the Crimean War. The strategic importance of the Saltley Depot lay in its status as the last large accessible stockpile of solid fuel in the country, with up to 700 vehicles collecting coke daily for industrial use. The National Union of Mine Workers sought to prevent the movement of this fuel to power stations and industries, thereby intensifying pressure on the government and the National Coal Board. Initially, there was a group of 2,000 miners from Staffordshire who attempted to picket the site, but their efforts were ineffective against the large number of strike-breaking lorries. Birmingham City Police were deployed to maintain access for lorries, but their presence was soon challenged by a growing number of pickets. By the 10th of February that year, the number of pickets had swelled to an estimated 15,000, including miners from South Yorkshire and South Wales, but the lorries were still getting through. Then something quite amazing happened. 50,000 of Birmingham's unionised engineering workers in small and large factories alike heeded the call to down tools, walk off their jobs, and march to Saltley to join the pickets in solidarity with the miners. They overwhelmed the police forces, leading the chief constable to order that the depot gates be closed in the interests of public safety. The closure marked a decisive victory for the pickets and was hailed as a major triumph for workers' solidarity. The event also became known as the Miners' Agincourt and significantly elevated the profile of Arthur Scargill, then a regional NUM official who emerged as a national figure and was later described as a tribune of the working class. The government agreed to a pay rise of 21%, a major victory that broke the government's pay restraint policy. The battle is remembered as a landmark moment in British Labour history, symbolising the power of coordinated industrial action and inter-union solidarity. If only workers realised today the power they actually have. Remember the Percy Shelley quote, "Ye are many, they are few." Later in 1972, a national building workers' strike started, again led by activists on several sites across Britain and coordinated by a group known as the Building Workers' Charter, a rank and file organisation. They organised flying pickets to persuade workers on other building sites to come out in support. Within a couple of weeks, virtually every major building site in Britain was brought to a halt, and the trade union leadership were forced to make the strike official. After 13 weeks, it resulted in a 30% increase in basic pay and improvements in conditions of employment for all building workers. Nevertheless, the employers were bitter about this and decided to get their revenge with waves of victimisation and blacklisting. Long after the strike was over, representatives of the major contracting companies, Conservative government ministers, senior police officers, and members of the security services all got together and colluded to charge a number of building workers from the Northwest with common law conspiracy. A National Federation of Building Trade Employers dossier on picketing during the strike, which included sensationalised press cuttings from the right-wing press, was sent to Conservative Home Secretary Robert Carr. Before the building strike had even started, Carr had circulated a statement to chief constables throughout the country telling them to take a harder line on picketing. Robert McAlpine, and I'm sure you're familiar with the name McAlpine, also who was managing director of the largest construction company in Britain, also wrote to the Commissioner for the Metropolitan Police, Sir Robert Mark, complaining that the law had not been enforced at Shrewsbury. Mark gave his support describing, this is the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Mark gave his support describing the Shrewsbury pickets' crimes, in inverted commas, as worse even than murder. The High Sheriff of Denbighshire, who not incidentally was the ninth member of the McAlpine family to have held that post, also gave his support. The Home Secretary then pressurised the police to arrest and charge those who had taken part in picketing at Shrewsbury. All those involved in picketing at Shrewsbury, incidentally, had been congratulated at the time by police officers on the ground for their impeccable behaviour when visiting other sites to persuade workers to join the strike. The police commanding officer went so far as to shake by the hand one of the leading pickets, Des Warren, and congratulate him on the discipline and good humour of the strikers. All of this counted for nothing. 35 were arrested and charged with conspiracy under common law. 11 were acquitted at Mould Crown Court after defence lawyers had exercised their right to challenge potential jurors. The remaining 24 were all found guilty at Shrewsbury Crown Court after the Lord Chancellor had intervened to abolish the defence's ability to challenge jurors. Also, the day before the prosecution completed its case, ITV screened a 60-minute documentary entitled Reds Under the Bed, which showed supposed violence by pickets and closed with a Conservative MP talking about violence in the building workers' strike. This was followed by a half-hour discussion programme, not shown in every ITV region, but transmitted by ATV, the region that covered Shrewsbury. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office's Information Research Department, and this is the group that were later guilty of giving information to employers to blacklist workers, admitted having a hand in that television program. It showed two of the defendants taking part in protest marches, and these images were interspersed with footage of damage on building sites alleged to have been caused by the trade unionists. Despite all this, the judge dismissed complaints that this amounted to contempt of court. At the trial, the jurors were also given assurances informally that if the defendants were found guilty, they would most likely just get small fines. Many of the jurors were said to look deeply shocked at the sentences that were handed out. 21 of the defendants were indeed just fined, but John Mackenzie Jones was given a 6-month jail sentence. Ricky Tomlinson was given 2 years in prison, and Des Warren was sentenced to 3 years. As Des Warren said from the dock at the time, the only conspiracy that had taken place was a conspiracy by the capitalist class. Laughably, the judge warned Warren that this was not a political trial and that he should not use the opportunity to address the jury to make a political speech. Ricky Tomlinson, who of course became an actor when he came out of jail because he couldn't get any work as a plasterer because he was blacklisted, still maintains, in his words, it was a show trial. We were whipping boys. He's still blacklisted and is still campaigning with us in the blacklist support group to clear his name. As for Des Warren, While in prison, he was continually drugged with a cocktail of tranquilizers, colloquially known as liquid cosh. His family and friends are all convinced that this resulted in him contracting Parkinson's disease and dying at the early age of 66. There's much more to this, but and much more shocking details of this ruling class conspiracy against building workers and against Warren and Tomlinson in particular in my article on blacklisting in Socialist History, volume 50. Also, much of the evidence of the conspiracy was later uncovered by a campaigner on behalf of the Shrewsbury 24, Eileen Turnbull, as well as by Labour MP and now Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham. Andy Burnham uncovered a lot of the ruling class conspiracy, but the mainstream media never talk about it. But after this, Heath turned to an incomes policy, but inflation continued to worsen. The incomes policy was abandoned in 1973 when OPEC imposed an oil embargo that nearly doubled prices within months. The embargo was a response to countries supporting Israel during the Yom Kippur War. So there's something that is very similar to what's going on today. But the oil crisis led to substantial petrol shortages and sharply increased prices. Although the embargo officially ended in March 1974, oil prices remained high due to sustained supply constraints and OPEC's strategic pricing decisions. The economic consequences were severe. The combination of rising oil prices and stagnant economic growth led to a phenomenon known as stagflation, which is high inflation coupled with high employment and economic stagnation. Now, all industrialized economies face widespread disruptions, including long queues at petrol stations, rationing of fuel, and reduced industrial output. In response, the government implemented measures including plans for fuel rationing. We all got issued with petrol rationing books. I don't know whatever happened to mine, but because in the end they were never used. Significantly, it fundamentally altered economic policy, leading to a re-evaluation of monetary and fiscal strategies. In particular, the growing popularization of monetarist policies and what are called supply-side economics to control inflation were increasingly championed by the right wing as a solution, something that we'll look at next time. Now, miners who had seen their rise from 2 years before turn into a pay cut in real terms due to the inflation that the government had not brought under control, voted overwhelmingly to go on strike again in late January 74. As a consequence, the 1974 miners' strike was driven by demands for a significant wage rise to offset the rising cost of living, with the National Union of Mine Workers looking for a 35% increase, which the Conservative government under Edward Heath refused to accept. The strike was part of a broader wave of industrial unrest during the winter of 73-74, which included action by dockers, railway workers and other public sector employees. The strike once again severely disrupted the country's energy supply, as coal was the primary fuel for electricity generation at the time. In response, the government introduced a 3-day working week starting on the 1st of January 1974 in order to conserve electricity. A measure that restricted commercial electricity use to 3 consecutive days per week, and companies weren't allowed to work longer hours to make up the shortfall. This policy caused widespread disruption to businesses, schools, and public services, with many people continuing to work either by candlelight or just during daylight hours. Television broadcasters were ordered to stop broadcasting at 10:30 at night to reduce energy consumption. Essential services such as hospitals, supermarkets, and newspaper printing presses were exempt, however. The government were attempting to shift public opinion against the miners, framing the strike as a threat to national stability. In a bid to gain political leverage, Heath called a general election on the 28th of February 1974, framing the vote around the question of who governs Britain. However, it backfired on him, and the election resulted in a hung parliament. The Conservative government was defeated, leading to the formation of a Labour government under Harold Wilson, with the support of the Liberal Party, as it was called then, in what was called the Lib-Lab Pact. The new Labour government appointed the veteran left-wing campaigner Michael Foot as Secretary of State for Employment. He swiftly negotiated a settlement with the miners. The NUM accepted a 35% pay rise, which was worth more than double the previous offer from the Heath government. The strike ended with a significant victory for the miners, resulting not only in improved wages, but also in a new superannuation scheme and a compensation scheme for miners who were suffering from the lung disease pneumoconiosis, which some of you might have heard of. The strike demonstrated the immense power of organised labour and marked a pivotal moment in British industrial relations. However, soaring inflation in the 1970s reached its peak in 1975 at close to 30%, with workers and their trade unions chasing ever-increasing prices, fueled mainly by rising oil prices. The situation was unsustainable, especially as property speculators, or SPIVs as I like to call them, on the stock exchange were exploiting the high levels of inflation. This prompted the Labour Chancellor Denis Healey to famously say that he would squeeze property speculators until the pips squeak. It was more generally seen as an attack not just on property speculators, but on the wealthy in general. The quote has endured as a symbol of his confrontational style and commitment to economic fairness. However, his approach, including plans to increase taxes on high earners and shift towards direct taxation, contributed to a significant political backlash. In 1976, there was a severe fall in the value of the pound. Chancellor Denis Healey was forced to apply for a £3.9 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. The crisis stemmed from a combination of a large fiscal deficit, a balance of payments deficit, and a loss of international confidence by speculating SPIVs. The IMF's conditions for the loan included strict austerity measures such as public spending cuts and higher interest rates, which were intended to restore fiscal discipline and market confidence. In other words, confidence amongst the spivs on the stock exchange. Healy, who had initially resisted the need for an IMF bailout, eventually backed down. So instead of grasping the nettle, he accepted the necessity of the loan to stabilise the economy and prevent a potential default or siege economy. The IMF's involvement was seen as a pivotal moment in shifting UK economic policy away from Keynesianism towards supply side economics and fiscal restraint. We saw a similar thing the IMF did in Greece a few years ago in holding the Greek economy to ransom in the same way. Um, But a crucial point in the struggle by workers came between 1976 and 1978 with a strike at the Grunwick Film Processing Laboratories in Willesden, North London. They processed, this was before we had cameras on mobile phones, they processed people's films. Initially, 6 workers began picketing the factory. The strike quickly grew, with over 137 workers joining the picket lines. The workers were, many of them were of East African Asian origin. They were largely non-unionised at the outset, but with support from the local Brent Trades Council, they joined APEX, the Association of Professional Executive Clerical and Computer Staff, a white-collar union. This was on the advice of the TUC when they inquired what union should they join. It was a big mistake. Apex, the union, were not big enough or strong enough and had a right-wing leader, Roy Grantham, who had, shall we say, a cosy relationship with employers, as many unions representing white-collar workers did at the time. They would have been better off joining the Transport and General Workers Union. The women were striking against an abusive and tyrannical regime led by the employer George Ward. Laurie Pavitt, an MP for Brent South, described Grunwick as a sweatshop with a management that could have been lifted straight out of the Dickens era. The dispute became a cause célèbre for the trade union movement, drawing widespread attention, frequent violent confrontations with the Metropolitan Police's Special Patrol Group, and over 500 arrests, the highest number in any industrial dispute since the 1926 general strike. The strikers, often dubbed strikers in saris by the media, were the first predominantly Asian workers to be supported by the wider trade union movement. The strikers were led by Jayaben Desai, a Gujarati woman and one of my all-time heroes, whose leadership became symbolic of the fight for dignity and workers' rights in a sweatshop industry. The strike gained national and international attention with support from major trade unions such as the Transport and General Workers Union, the Union of Post Office Workers, and the TUC in general. A postal boycott was introduced by the Union of Post Office Workers, which significantly impacted Grunwick's mail order business, although under pressure from the courts, that was later withdrawn. On selected days, there were mass pickets to try to stop scabs going into the plant. On a number of occasions, Arthur Scargill brought 5,000 miners down from Yorkshire to support the pickets. On one of those occasions, I took 200 building workers from the site I was convener of shop stewards on to support the strikers. That was half of our workforce. We had 400 workers on the site, and 200 of them agreed to come to the picket line. So the dispute was marked by deep political and ideological divisions. The government commissioned the Scarman inquiry, chaired by Lord Scarman, which recommended union recognition and reinstatement of the workers who had all been sacked for daring to go on strike. However, the employer, George Ward, backed by the right-wing National Association for Freedom, rejected the recommendations, which were not legally binding. He claimed that he would only abide by a court of law. Furthermore, right-wing forces and the right-wing media in particular accused the strikers of intimidating scabs and the thousands of police deployed to support the management of Grumwick. So this is Jabin Desai, surrounded by police officers as she frequently was, and I would just ask the question, who is intimidating who? Disgracefully, the TUC subsequently withdrew its support, and the strike committee announced the end of the dispute in June 1978 without achieving union recognition or re-employment. There is a lesson here that when the chips are down, the TUC almost always bottle it, as they did in 1926. But even more disgracefully, when Jayaben Desai picketed Congress House, the TUC building, demanding that the TUC continue to support the strikers, she had her union membership rescinded. As I say, a disgrace, but also a capitulation that was seized on by the right-wing establishment to attack trade unionism relentlessly for the next 40 years. Despite the defeat, the Grumwick strike had lasting significance. It was the first major industrial dispute in Britain where the majority of strikers were from an ethnic minority and still received widespread support from the labour movement, challenging previous patterns of marginalisation and racism within trade unions. So the strike highlighted issues of race, gender, and class and became a pivotal moment in British trade union history, symbolising both the potential for cross-racial solidarity and also the limitations of institutional union support. We shall see the implications of this next time. If you've never seen it and get the chance to see it, this stage play about Jayaben Desai is very inspiring. I know that some of you saw it when it came to the Theatre Royal in Bury St Edmunds. The title refers to Jayaben's parting remark to her manager as she left the factory to go on strike. She famously said to her manager, "What you are running here is not a factory, it is a zoo. But in a zoo, there are many types of animals. Some are monkeys who dance on your fingertips. Others are lions who can bite your head off. We are the lions, Mr. Manager." If you want to read more about the importance of the Grumwick strike for the future of the labour movement, then do read this book. It's a seminal account of the dispute in the workers' own words and told by two of the leading supporters of the strike. Jack Dromey was secretary of the Brent Trades Council and a member of the Grumwick Strike Committee throughout the dispute, and Graham Taylor he wasn't the one that was England manager, was a lifelong trade union member, first in the Transport and General Workers Union, which is now part of Unite, and then in NATV, which is now part of UCU, my union, and was on the executive committee of Brent Trades Council during the strike. Now, 50 years later, its themes still resonate for low paid, unorganised workers at the likes of McDonald's and Deliveroo. It's vital reading for those who are trying to organise in their workplaces. At the time, this book was the seminal account of the dispute, providing the workers' own story in their own words and told by two of the leading participants in the strike. The crisis for capitalism culminated in what came to be dubbed the Winter of Discontent. Despite raging inflation, the Labour government under Jim Callaghan imposed a 5% limit on wage increases as part of a so-called social contract with trade union leaders. This precipitated a period of widespread strikes and social unrest, predominantly by low-paid workers, between September 1978 and February 1979. The crisis began with a strike by Ford workers in September 1978, who rejected a 5% pay rise and eventually secured a 17% increase after a 9-week walkout. This was followed by a major lorry drivers' strike in January 1979, which disrupted fuel supplies and led to petrol station closures across the country. Public sector workers, including NHS ancillary staff, refuse collectors, grave diggers, and ambulance drivers, then joined the strike, resulting in uncollected rubbish piling up in public spaces like London's Leicester Square, unburied bodies in Liverpool, and hospitals operating emergency only services. The unrest culminated in a general strike on the 22nd of January 1979, involving 1.5 million workers. This was all exacerbated by the coldest winter for 16 years, in which severe storms isolated many remote areas of the country. The unrest had deeper causes besides resentment of the caps on pay rises. Labour's internal divisions over its lack of commitment to socialism manifested in disputes over labour law reform and a macroeconomic strategy during the 60s and early 70s. It pitted constituency members against the party's establishment led by Callaghan. Something that we've seen again more recently. Many of the strikes, like the gravediggers' strike in Liverpool and the ancillary workers in hospitals across the country, were also initiated at the local level, with national union leaders largely unable to stop them despite their social contract with the Labour leadership, which many of us at rank and file level called the social contract rather than the social contract. As I said, the winter of discontent was driven by a combination of different social and economic and political factors which had been developing since the 1950s. Under the influence of Anthony Crosland, a right-wing member of the Labour Party in the 1950s, the party establishment came to embrace a less socialist course of action than it had in its earlier years before the Second World War. Crosland had argued in his book, The Future of Socialism, that the government exerted enough control over private industry that it wasn't necessary to nationalise any more of it, as the party had long called for. He argued that the ultimate goals of the party could be readily achieved by assuring long-term economic stability and building on the welfare state. This revisionist view had entrenched Labour in a post-war consensus, as I said earlier, in which both they and the Tories agreed in principle on a strong government role in the economy, strong unions, and a welfare state as foundational to Britain's prosperity. However, I'm going on a bit longer than I intended to, but however, in the 1970s, following the surge in radical left-wing politics of the late 60s, that view of Crosslands was challenged in another book by a Labour Party luminary called Stuart Holland. In Stuart Holland's book, The Socialist Challenge, I did have a copy that I bought and read at the time. I've had a look for it on my shelves and I can't find it. I must have lent it to somebody and not got it back. Anyway, Stuart Holland argued that contrary to Crossland's assertions, the government could exercise very little control over Britain's largest companies if they remained in private hands. He argued that these large corporations were likely to continue consolidating into an oligarchy. In other words, where power would be concentrated in the hands of a small group of extremely wealthy capitalists who by the 1980s would be able to raise prices enough that governments following Keynesian economic policies would be unable to ensure full employment that they had been able to since the war. Furthermore, he argued that these multinational corporations would be able to employ strategies of transfer pricing to avoid paying British taxes. Transfer pricing is where the sale of goods or services between different parts of the same company or group in different parts of the world at higher or lower than market value is used in order to avoid paying tax. Holland called for returning to nationalisation, arguing that taking control of the top 25 companies in the UK would result in a market with more competition and less inflation. Holland's ideas formed the basis of what became known as the alternative economic strategy that was promoted by Tony Benn, who was Secretary of State for Industry under the Labour governments of both Harold Wilson and James Callaghan. Um, uh, Tony Benn came very, very close to winning the Labour leadership. Although he never won the top leadership post, having lost the 1976 contest to James Callaghan when only MPs were allowed to vote, his near victory in 1981 signalled the rise of the Bennite left and arguably laid the groundwork for future left-wing influence, including the eventual leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. The alternative economic strategy called on British politicians to adopt a protectionist stance in international trade rather than imposing an incomes policy to combat inflation. But the government ultimately rejected it in favour of the social contract. This contributed to the collapse of Callaghan's government after a no confidence vote, paving the way for Margaret Thatcher's Conservative victory in the May 1979 general election, which represented a seismic shift in British politics and British society more generally, the consequences of which are still with us nearly 50 years later. that I'll look at next time. Um, okay, thanks. I've left some bits out because it was running on a bit, and I want to leave a bit of time for questions. Okay, thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Jack. That was very informative. I enjoyed the bits about Jabin, and I saw the Townsend Productions performance, which I thought was phenomenal.
Oh yeah, you were there, weren't you? Yeah, I remember you
I
being
was
there.
there, and I keep telling Louise off and telling her, when are you coming back to sort of the East region?
Yeah, yeah,
Because they come back sometimes with the different ones, like Ragged Trouser Philanthropists and
yeah, yeah,
some of their other ones. But with We Are Lions, Mr. Manager,
yeah.
you have to go a bit further. But it was great, thank you. I was wondering, would anyone like to ask Jack anything? You got some lovely comments there, Jack.
Right, let's where are we? I'm looking for chat. There we go. Mm,
Yeah. This is Joe,
right.
Susie, and Pinky. Hello, Kevin. You're on mute, Kevin. You missed most of
Hello.
it.
I know it took me ages to work out how to get
Yeah.
it.
Oh, hello, Kevin.
I'm feeling a bit of a twit, sorry. But I didn't give up, and
Oh,
That's
I'll
impressive.
know for next time.
okay. You got a question, Kevin?
No, I'm just typing. Well, ignore me. Go to other questions. I'll come back with a question in a minute.
Yeah, okay. So much information.
I think Jacobin's the Granwich strike happened a month after I was born.
Really, really.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
One of my abiding memories of that was there were several entrances to the works. One was in a place called Chapter Road, and I can remember being in Chapter Road. There were bicycle sheds on the opposite side of the road, and all the photographers from the mainstream media, the daily newspapers, were on top of those bicycle sheds, and they were shouting, "Get stuck into the police," and things like that, so they could get some pictures. Um, and most of the strikers showed incredible restraint, even though they were attacked by police officers. I remember even Arthur Scargill's father, who was retired by then, was in a group that I was with, and he was attacked by police. I mean, he was an old man.
That's just I just really love Jabin. I'll go back to her because she was so
Oh,
tall
right.
and so
Kev,
feisty. She was so fearless.
yeah, she was. She was,
Yeah.
yeah.
I, I,
Kevin's put on there that the Trades Council have been asked to fund the next Townsend Theatre production. There you are.
That's brilliant. And for everybody else, that he means the West Suffolk Trades
The West Suffolk
Council.
Trades Council, of
Not
which I,
necessarily the one where you are, so don't go
yeah,
asking anyone.
yeah,
Um,
I'll,
of which I'm chair, and we're meeting on Thursday.
I'll,
So we'll
we can have a
presumably discuss
discussion.
that, Kevin.
Yeah, we can have a discussion about that, Jack. Yeah. I've got a question, Jack, which is, did you think, I mean, I wasn't very old at the time, so I really wasn't thinking about it too much, but I do remember it
So
very
everybody's
vividly.
younger than me, Kevin.
I do remember, well, I'm catching you up, mate. Um, did you think, as someone who's involved in it, did you think A, you could win? B, what were you trying to win? Those are my questions when you were taking industrial action.
Right. What we wanted to see was a redistribution of wealth and power in Britain, and we thought we could win. Um, from when I became involved in the late 60s, you know that 1968 was the year of revolutions
Yeah,
across Europe. And from then onwards, the trade union movement was growing stronger and stronger, and we thought we could win. Um, and as I say, our goal was a complete redistribution of wealth and power in Britain, and we thought that was achievable, and I think it was achievable. We came within, a whisker of achieve at least partially achieving that, I think.
In what way? By winning a Labour Party leadership election, by Tony Benn winning that, do you think?
Yeah,
That's the method. Yeah.
yeah. Because as Ben said himself, most politics takes place outside Parliament,
Mm,
but Parliament becomes a reflection of what takes place outside Parliament. And so, um, his nearly coming to be leader of the Labour Party was a reflection of what was going on outside Parliament. And, he came within 0.5% of winning the Labour leadership.
mm.
There's a
And how,
question
go
from
on.
Edward, I think.
Yeah,
Hi,
Edward. Hi,
Jack.
Edward.
Thanks for another very informative and insightful talk. I was just wondering if, we're talking about industrial disputes in the 70s, are you familiar with the Lucas plan that was drawn up
Yeah,
by Lucas Aerospace workers?
yeah.
I'm just wondering if you've sort of had any sort of thoughts on that, given what you said about the sort of difference between union bureaucracy and the sort of lay people like yourself, and what it potentially says for like collective bargaining approaches going forward.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question, Edward. I, I'm I haven't got it all at my fingertips, but I do remember the Lucas thing. As I mean, there's so many others, um, events and strikes and that I remember, like the Upper Clyde shipbuilders strike, as well as Lucas. But Lucas was, well, do you want to explain what the Lucas?
Essentially, so obviously I can't say I was there, but in the 70s, workers from Lucas Aerospace were threatened with redundancy
Yeah,
and responded by creating a plan for alternative models of production for alternate
yeah,
particular things like socially useful products um in to move away from the company's use, reliance on war for the sort of military industrial
yeah,
complex.
yeah. Yeah, and they proposed a cooperative, the same as the Upper Clyde shipbuilders did, but the Lucas plan was kind of trying to put the alternative economic strategy into some um, into practice, um, but unfortunately, I can't remember exactly what happened at the end of it.
I think there's a document, there's a sort of it's a video on, it's just on YouTube, that was sort of taken from, I think, during the process, called the plan. I
Yeah.
think a part of it was, they said that just there was a difficulty with getting it through the union bureaucracy, and also there were laws against allowing the trade the sort of a trade union to bring it up in Parliament. I can't quite exactly remember, but I do know there is a video. It should be, it is on YouTube, and it is just from the words of the people who are involved in it.
Okay, I'll have to look that up again because it's a while since I've kind of looked at that. But as I say, very similar to what happened with the Upper Clyde shipbuilders, who were threatened with closure and redundancy, so they took over the yard, and the workers ran the yard themselves as a workers' cooperative. Um, but yeah, yeah, it's an interesting point.
Thanks very much
Thanks,
for.
Edward. Yeah, somebody else?
I just wanted to ask one quick question about how you see trade unionism today. Do you feel it's so much harder to get those wins? Do you feel like Parliament has sort of drawn away from the people so significantly that it's more difficult to find that power as a collective, or do you think it's the same?
I think Claire, we've had nearly 50 years of anti-trade union legislation, which makes it extremely difficult to actually go on strike and remain within the law now. Almost impossible. Um, but I mean, um, that's one of the major reasons, I think, uh, that employers over the last 50 years have been emboldened to um, to stand up when trade unions have um, attempted to um, progress their plans. You know, it's but as far as Parliament is concerned, one of the things I think that we've seen with Labour in particular, is that whereas many MPs in the Labour Party used to come from working class organisations, they used to come from trade unions, and they used to have kind of working class jobs. It's packed full of lawyers now and people who have very little experience of what it means to work in a factory or in a hospital or in a school or and you know, for example, at that time, in the 1970s, um, you know, we sponsored an MP in my union who was a carpenter from Liverpool, Eric Heffer, and Eric Heffer was a junior minister. So they had some influence, but I think that's gone by and large now.
Okay, it's getting towards 8:30. So Kevin's got a question, and Joe, I'll just read a comment out. She said, I've been researching someone's family tree recently and discovered that one of their ancestors was an Indian indentured labourer who was sent to British uh, Guyana, as it
Mm.
was at the time. Fascinating story, but shameful how they were used to replace slaves after slavery was abolished. They were treated terribly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay,
That's the bit of British history that they like to keep covered up. Yeah,
okay, Kevin.
Kevin. Yeah.
Um,
Thank you, Joe.
so the is it Joe who mentioned the Lucas plan, or can't or Edward? I can't remember. Anyway, it was one of the things that I had down on a list of things to be discussed at the West Suffolk Trades Council as a possible thing to show following up the peace conference in London in June, because part of the logic behind the Lucas plan was that they would move away from manufacturing weapons towards socially useful stuff. And I thought that showing that film and having a discussion afterwards might be an interesting follow up to that peace conference. So that's something for us to think about. I'll just mention that. And I'm just going to end with another question, Jack, which is, you know, do you think that winning in Parliament is enough? You know, so when I look at trade unions, a lot of them are they've they've really accepted the social contract that Tony Blair proposed, and you know they've got a bureaucracy and a lot of activists who really buy into that. So they're not trying to build something that lasts, and that is aiming for social change, really. And I think that's part of the issue. And so the trade unions themselves have changed socially. You know, I can't perceive something like the winter discontent happening again. And the unions would say that's because their members have changed, but which is I think is right. There's a whole cost of that hegemony there, but also about the unions themselves have changed. I think.
Mm. Yeah. Um, I mean, one of the things about the Employment Rights Act, which I'm going to be talking about later on, is that in the negotiations that took place between the Labour Party and the trade unions, not a single lay activist was involved in any of those discussions. And that's what's wrong. That, even those that have got lay executives, like Unite, for example, none of the lay members were involved in any discussions at all. And that's what's wrong. That the laity should be the ones that are involved in those discussions because they're the ones, at the chalk face, that, have to live with the consequences of the Employment Rights Act. Um, so, I mean, that's the thing that's wrong. Going back to what you first started off with, I can always remember going to Burston and seeing Tony Blair, not Tony Blair, Tony Benn back in the 90s when Blair was elected in 97. And Tony Benn, when he got up on the platform, he said, "So you've elected a Labour government, so what? Um, you know, do you just suddenly expect you're going to get a socialist society? No, you're not. You have to fight for it on the streets every day, every single day, in the workplace, um, to get a socialist society. Parliament won't give it to you." And I think he's absolutely right now.
Yeah, I really agree with you, and that's one of the reasons why what I've remained a trade union activist. Simply putting leaflets through people's doors and saying vote for us and we'll change the world. That is not going to change the world.
No,
It's only one small step towards it. You know,
yeah,
but our culture is such that people believe, they can vote every so often, hand over power to someone who probably might not do what you want them to do, might do a bit of what
yeah,
you want, but mostly won't, and then wonder why people get upset 4 years later.
yeah. Well, I think somebody once said to me, "We've got a 5 minute, 5 year democracy. You get you get 5 minutes every 5 years to exercise your democratic right. The rest of the time you are dictated to."
Yeah,
Yeah.
So
we
thank
could go
you.
on for hours. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. The events at West Suffolk Trades Council sound very exciting as well. Thank you for that. Um, Jack, I just wonder if with it being bank holiday next Monday, are you still on? You're still on, aren't you? Your next.
I'm still on as long as people want me to do it. Yeah.
All right. I will put the link for tickets there in the chat if people want to come along next Monday. And what's the next one about?
Well,
Thatcherism?
the next one we're looking at Thatcherism, what
Mhm.
Thatcherism is, and what it's done um, to this country and what's happened during the Thatcher years and beyond, to change what we had previously.
Yeah, I sometimes see the type. I mean, I've been doing your courses a long time, and I'm your greatest follower.
You're my
Um,
groupie.
I am, yeah, because I always learn something new, and sometimes in each session it's more than other sessions, but I always learn, and I love to come, and I like your approach, and I follow it really well. So it'd be nice to see as many of you as possible there next Monday. You might have other things on, but thank you everybody for coming along. Um, and we can end it there if you're all right with that, Jack.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.